Hello, Yama everyone. My name's Heidi Norman and I'll be hosting the seminar today. Let me please start with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Certainly that's from where I am at the moment. This seminar series today is hosted by our research centre here at the University of Technology, Sydney, the Indigenous Land and Justice Research Hub. And we're part of the Centre for the Advancement of Indigenous Knowledges within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at UTS. So the focus of our webinar today, over the next hour or so, we're going to hear from 4 pretty awesome speakers, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But as you would know, the focus of our discussion today is in relation to an appeal that Dolly Talbot has led, a defence of Gomeroi lands in northwestern New South Wales, that recently culminated in the Federal Minister rejecting an application for the protection of significant areas over Gomeroi grasslands, plains country of northwestern New South Wales. There are significant sites at risk over Gomeroi country as a result of an application by the Shenhua watermark mine for what will be a mega mine close to Breeza. The Minister acknowledged at that time the immeasurable value of the Gomeroi sites that the mine would destroy, that Dolly Talbot has led with the Gomeroi Traditional Owners Group since at least 2015 and before, to defend those sites from destruction if that coal mine is extended. And that's what we'll be looking at today. Some of the broader questions we'll address, as well as hearing an update on the kind of legal action, the kind of support that we can be extending to Dolly's campaign and action, and the broader questions about the cultural heritage laws, whether they're fit for purpose at the state and the federal level. And then we'll also ask some bigger questions about the alternatives to coal mining on Gomeroi country and indeed other lands. So let me just briefly go through the bios of our 4 awesome speakers today, and then we'll start with Dolly Talbot. So Dolly is a Gomeroi woman. She was born and raised in Gunnedah on that beautiful flat country. Dolly's ancestors have lived on Gomeroi country for at least 10 generations. She's among many Gomeroi traditional owners who have been campaigning against extractive projects on country. These projects have included the Whitehaven's Vickery mine extension and Santos coal seam gas, or the Narrabri gas project that is currently under consideration for approval in the Pilbara forest. We'll hear from Nadia Zimmerman she's coming to us from Melbourne. Nadia is a solicitor with the Environmental Defenders Office and has been working with Dolly. She advises and represents clients in a broad range of state and federal public interest environmental and planning law matters. Nadia has a particular interest in climate litigation and Aboriginal cultural heritage protection. Next, we'll hear from Tony McAvoy. Tony is our first Indigenous Senior Counsel, the first Indigenous Senior Counsel. He's a Murray man. He's co-chair of the Indigenous Legal Issues Committee of the Law Council of Australia. He has a strong practicing native title and pretty long-standing experience in the areas of environmental, administrative, criminal law and discrimination law. And finally, we'll hear from Tim Buckley. Tim will bring a different perspective to our discussion. He's coming from the Director of Energy and Finance Studies at the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis. He's got some 25 years of financial markets experience, specialising in equity valuation, including as a top-rated analyst and co-founder and managing director of ARC's Investment Management. So we've got a pretty outstanding panel here. Just before I hand over to Dolly, thank you all very much for your time, and thank you all very much for joining us. As you would know, sometimes this Zoom, it has its upsides, which is that we can be joined from across the country, but we may also experience technical difficulties. So hang with us if that does arise, and please bear with us should that arise while we get things fixed. If you're interested in social media, Twitter, the hashtag is cultural vandalism, and our handle is ILJRH_UTS. We also have a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, so if you have any questions, we'll put them at the end of our discussion. So let me now please hand over to you, Dolly, to update us on the kind of action you've been taking over the last several years.
Well, Yama, everyone, thank you for the invitation to speak today. As been said, I'm Dolly Torbett. I'm a Gomeroi woman from Gunnedah in northwest New South Wales. I'm not going to speak too much about the legalities of things today. I'll leave that up to Nadia to do that. I want to speak more from a personal point of view. But firstly, I want to pay my respects to the Wabikal people whose lands I speak from today. I also want to pay my respects to my Gomeroi people and elders, both past and present, and acknowledge and remember the sacrifices they made for us. To me, respecting my elders and the legacy of our ancestors is something I take seriously. It's not just a phrase I use in a speech, it's something I live by and has fueled me to carry on the fight to protect country and all that is sacred to us as a people. Shenhua Watermark Coal is a foreign-owned mining company owned by the People's Republic of China, and it is this company who intend to blow up the country of my Gomeroi people and all the sacred places within. In 2012, we first met with Shenhua and spoke about the culturally sacred places. We spoke about the large grinding groove sites and the need to protect them, and the burials and other sites which form our story and connection of our ancestors' footprint on the black soil plains near Breeza. These grinding groove sites are where men carried out sacred ceremony. They are where they prepared for the war, and not just against other invading mobs, but against a regiment when they first invaded our Gomeroi lands. It was at this sacred place our warriors sharpened and made their spears and axe heads and watched the regiment encroach on our sacred lands, high from the top of a place called Watermark Mountain. Imagine yourself sitting high on that mountain and how our ancestors must have felt knowing the devastation to come as word had already spread and filtered through of the regiment's intent. These same sacred places hold the burials of our people and the story of the massacres that took place there. If you look on the grounds, there are axe heads, spear heads still scattered all around, and the scar trees are there for all to see. All these sacred places tell a story, individually and collectively, and are sacred and irreplaceable to us and our people. These same sacred places are what Shenhua want to blow up, just as they have with the Rio Tinto, the Juunkan Gorge cave in WA. And they are what the Australian government are allowing mining companies to blow up by not ensuring proper fit-for-purpose legislation to stop them. Every day in this country, our culture is blown up and destroyed at the stroke of a pen, and it's our people who once again are left to feel the heartache and disconnection to country that this causes. In 2015, on behalf of 192 Gomeroi people, steered by our elders, we lodged an application with the Federal Minister for Environment after exhausting all avenues to protect these sacred places. The application under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protection Act is a last resort for protection. And after various ministerial changes, our application finally ended up with the now Minister for Environment, Susan Ley, who acknowledged, as previously said, our sacred places were of immeasurable cultural value, but still declined to protect them, stating the economic and social benefits to the area outweigh the heritage value. This in an area where there is already a saturation of mining. After losing this application, we appealed in the Federal Court, where we were again unsuccessful. We currently have a new Section 10 under the APSIP Act, with 600 Gomeroi people a party to that new application. Our people have jumped through all the hoops required by this government legislation, with the burden of proof to prove our connection and existence of these sites. Even after proving this, it's still not enough. We met the criteria of the Protection Act that fails to protect, that provides a clause to allow government to consider money. How does money belong in this act? We, as traditional people, didn't use money. It's supposed to be the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. It might as well be the Destroy Culture for Money Act, because that's exactly what it does. Our people have copped it on the chin, suffered abuse and disrespect, And we've had non-Aboriginal people deciding if our sacred places are significant enough to matter. And we've had to listen to the bullshit that social and economical rewards are more important to this country than our sacred places, than our connection and our footprints of our ancestors. And I'm sure with the onset of the COVID-19, the so-called leaders of this country will feel even more justified about how much more important money is compared to our sacred places. I wonder, would they sell the Opera House? What other country blows up burial sites and destroys their own waterways, killing the river systems and areas that supply our food? How do we let them? Something has to change. Our history is a shared history, and unfortunately much of it's sad. Our sacred places should mean something to all Australians, with some of them exceeding 40,000 plus years old. When there is a threat in this country to European heritage, such as Captain Cook's statue, the government send police to protect it and jail those who deface it. When our ancient sites are threatened, the government departments sanction the defacing and destruction and jail us for protecting what we believe is sacred. If these sacred places are destroyed, we are unable to fulfil our cultural obligation to each other, our ancestors, our children and our grandchildren, and other nations who share our songlines. And it is us who suffer these cultural consequences. My dad left this world disappointed and saddened by the politicians in this country and the fact that still today they have such a lack of compassion and understanding and respect for First Nations people. And it's obvious the scars sadly seem to widen rather than heal. Our people are incarcerated more than any other, our children are still being taken, and our suicide rates are astronomical. And yes, these all relate to dispossession of land and culture. I don't want to leave this land like my dad, still fighting and disillusioned. Change needs to happen in this country. We want you to walk with us and hear us and respect us. We need to protect the land and the waters and sacred places within, and it should mean something to all Australians. And we can make the changes that need to happen. As we often say, these issues are not black or white issues. They are right or wrong issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolly. Thank you so much. I'll now ask Nadia to comment further on the legal case that Dolly has been pursuing over the last several years.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Thanks for having me today. I'm on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'll talk about Dolly's case in the federal court, which was heard in March, and the outcome of that case and some of the problems in our laws that are highlighted by the case. The EDO started acting for Dolly in June last year after the minister had made her decision to refuse protection of these sites under the Federal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. The Act was set up as a tool of last resort and designed to operate when state and territory laws have failed to protect Aboriginal heritage. So Dolly's legal fight has been going on for a really long time and started before the Gomeroi traditional custodians made their first application to the minister in 2015. I'll give you a bit of a background about the Act. The way it works is it gives the Federal Environment Minister the power to make a declaration to protect specified sites or areas of Aboriginal cultural heritage where the minister has received an application by an Aboriginal person or a group of Aboriginal people. The object of the Act is the preservation and protection of areas and objects that are of particular significance to Aboriginal people. The Act's been around since about the 80s. It's hard to know how many applications have been made under the Act, but I think when we're talking about effectiveness, it's really telling that only a small number of protected declarations have ever been made by an Environment Minister who has received an application under the Act. The way the Act operates is that the Minister needs to be satisfied that the areas or sites have a particular significance to Aboriginal people in accordance with Aboriginal tradition, and that they are under threat of injury or desecration. In Dolly's case, that criteria was satisfied, and the Minister actually said in her statement of reasons that the sites and areas have immeasurable cultural value and connection to the country for the applicants and the Gomeroi people as a whole. And the Minister found that the sites were under threat of injury or desecration, including from the moving of grinding grooves, the destruction of scar trees, and from visual impacts to the landscape, which forms part of the cultural context for the sites and has cultural value in and of itself. If this mega mine goes ahead, the existing landscape would be replaced by a completely new mine-created landscape. But even though the Minister found those things, when she considered whether or not to grant protection of the site, the Minister formed the view that if protection was granted, then the coal mine wouldn't be able to go ahead. And so she considered evidence, which is mostly just material put forward by the coal mine about how they said that the community would suffer economic and social disadvantages if the coal mine didn't go ahead. So the Minister was concerned that there wouldn't be local jobs created by the mine, there wouldn't be money flowing into the economy. What the Minister then did was she weighed up the immeasurable cultural significance of the sites against the economic and social impacts on the local community and refused to protect the sites. And it was this consideration in her statement of reasons that we argued on behalf of Dolly and the Gomeroi traditional custodians was unlawful for her to consider. We argued that the legislation and by extension the Constitution didn't allow the Minister to perform that balancing exercise. In other words, the perceived social and economic benefits of the mine was an irrelevant consideration for the purpose of making a declaration under the Act. And the reason we argued this was because the Heritage Act was made under the racist power of the Constitution, and the racist power requires that there is a difference between the general public on the one hand and the people of an identified race on the other hand that enlivens the power in the Constitution. And we argued that the Minister's consideration of the social and economic benefits to the general community did not maintain that difference. But the federal court didn't agree. In July this year, the court handed down its decision and dismissed the Gomeroi traditional custodians' challenge. The court decided that it was lawful for the Minister to consider the social and economic benefits of the mine and rejected our argument that there is an implied limitation on the Minister's discretion that prevents her from taking into account considerations which do not have this differential operation. The court's reasoning was that the Heritage Act as a whole operates in connection with the racist power, and the Act is only triggered if the Minister has received an application on behalf of an Aboriginal person or group, and because the Minister has to be satisfied that the area is a significant Aboriginal area that's under threat of injury or desecration. And the court also said that the exercise of the discretion by reference to non-racial considerations by the Minister such as social and economic impacts, continues to have a differential operation because the purpose of the exercise of this discretion is to determine whether or not to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage. And the court said that this is enough of a connection to the race's power to make the decision lawful. So in terms of reform, I'll just make a few points about what this decision, I guess, highlights. The decision demonstrates that even though the Act is designed to protect places of significance to Aboriginal people, it's not fit for purpose because it permits Aboriginal heritage to be destroyed for the sake of short-term economic outcomes. It confirms that decisions under the Act about cultural heritage can simply be decided on a economic cost-benefit analysis. And the reality is that in almost every case where there are sites like this that are threatened, there's going to be, threat's going to come from a development project that will have some form of economic outcome for a community or a company or a state. And there's always going to be a financial reason not to protect sites from development proposals. And so if we're really serious about protecting Aboriginal cultural heritage, our laws really need to prioritise Aboriginal voices over short-term economic or financial gain. So we need decisions that are made independently from politics, which means decisions out of the hands of ministers, because otherwise the decisions are at the mercy of political whims. And another point to make is that the reform really has to go beyond the federal laws. At a state level, this case shows that a coal mine was approved by the state government that would completely obliterate this significant cultural heritage, and that was allowed to happen. If anyone wants more information about how laws could be improved to better protect Aboriginal cultural heritage, the EDO has made a submission to the inquiry into the Juunkan Gorge caves destruction, and people can access that online for more info. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nadia. Before we hear from Tony McAvoy, who I understand will pick up some of the themes you've touched on there, Nadia, and in the reforms that are needed to heritage protection at the state and federal level. Can I ask you and Dolly, please, just to briefly recap where things are at the minute? Because I understand you've, Dolly, lodged a fresh application to the federal minister.
Yes, we have, yeah. We currently have a new Section 10 application lodged with the minister, which includes more areas that are out within the Shenhua project. And there are 600 Gomeroi people that are a party to that application, and there are several other nations that are also a party to that application as their songlines connect with ours.
And what's the likely timeline for that in terms of that application? Because
the application is still being lodged in part. It isn't all complete just yet, but it has been lodged.
Yeah.
So, we don't know what the timeline looks like at the moment.
Yep, but this decision will rest with the federal minister, hey?
Yes, it will again.
Yeah, so the minister has another chance to protect the sites with more information provided by the group. I guess another issue in terms of this act is that there's no timeline for the minister to make a decision. So often these applications are just sitting with the minister for a long period of time. So, you know, political pressure is really important to sort of help speed things up. And I think at the end we can maybe talk about what people in the audience can do potentially to try and persuade the minister to make the right decision.
Yep, that will be great. Okay, thanks, Nadia. All right, to Tony McAvoy. Thanks, Tony, for joining us. I'm keen to hear your thoughts about the heritage protection laws.
Thank you, Heidi. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Gomeroi people whose country I'm on. I also want to acknowledge all of the other First Nations people who have joined today, our brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts. I want to acknowledge my people, the Rio people, our neighbours, the Kongaloo, the Wadja, and the Barada, the Yedimarala, the Janga, the Inungai, the Widi. I also want to acknowledge the other panellists and say, in particular, that there's almost nothing further I need to say after Dolly's presentation at the outset. That presentation, it seems to me, said everything that needs to be said at this point. But as I'm here to speak about the legal aspects of it, the Western law aspects of it, I will do that. So, from my perspective, the greatest impediment to the proper protection of the physical manifestations of our way of life is the colonial mindset. The colonial mindset remains rampant in this country. And although from time to time it seems to be politically convenient to present Australia as a country that cares about First Nations and our existence and our powers and our culture, for a very large sector of the society here, that veneer of care is merely the political price that is paid for the continued exercise of social licenses to extract maximum financial return from the exploitation of our lands and waters. One of the most stark examples of this can be found here in New South Wales. In 2001, the Legislative Assembly and then the Legislative Council of the New South Wales Parliament passed an act called the National Parks and Wildlife Amendment Act 2001, number 130. That bill became legislation. However, Schedule 3 of that amendment legislation was about Aboriginal cultural heritage, and it made a significant advancement for the time in the protection of Aboriginal objects and places. It proposed the change of language from the terminology of the 70s being Aboriginal relics to Aboriginal places. But most importantly, it removed the defence for people who damaged Aboriginal heritage. It removed the defence that they did it unknowingly. So in order to prove that somebody had committed an offence against the National Parks and Wildlife Act for damaging an Aboriginal object, at that time you had to prove that they had knowingly damaged that object. And it replaced it with the defence that they had to take reasonable precautions. So that was in Schedule 3 of the Amendment Act. The rest of that amendment was sent to the Governor for proclamation. But said Schedule 3 was never sent. So notwithstanding that both Houses of Parliament had passed the whole legislation, that there wasn't in the legislation any distinction between the various schedules, the Executive Council of the New South Wales Government, and Bob Carr was Premier at the time, did not send Schedule 3 to the Governor for proclamation. And that's the order in which things happen. Now, the question that arises from this is, who has the power to cause us Premier to subvert the will of Parliament and not provide to the Governor for commencement legislation which has passed both Houses of Parliament? Who has that power? Well, we know who has that power. So Schedule 3 to the 2001 Act was quietly repealed in 2010. The point I want to make about all of this is that there are very powerful forces at work which cause Australian governments to continue to disregard the international norms, particularly those gathered together under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In particular, I speak of the right to observe and continue to protect our lands and our cultures, and the right to exercise our free, prior and informed consent about matters that affect our lands and waters and our rights. We, at the present time in Australia, in all jurisdictions, but particularly so with the federal legislation, are stuck in a 1980s type world where it's as if the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People does not exist. But Tim will discuss it in a moment, that whilst the balance in the Native Title Act may have been very firmly set in favour of the mining companies by the Howard government in 1998 with the amendments to the Native Title Act, the financial sector is unwilling to, is displaying a reluctance, at least, to continue to support a mining industry that, whilst maybe acting within the letter of the law, is acting entirely immorally. So the question that I was asked to address was what reforms are needed. And in New South Wales, where the cultural heritage protection for Aboriginal sites exists within the National Parks and Wildlife Act, I say that the whole system needs to be replaced. It needs to be removed from the National Parks and Wildlife Act. There needs to be new standalone legislation. And that legislation needs to incorporate some very fundamental principles. And I'll list 4 of them now. The first is that there should be respect for the right to free, prior and informed consent. In the way that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People demands, for First Nations people to be empowered to make decisions about significance, that's how important a site is, and also about protection, about the level of protection that those places and sites are afforded. The second principle that I believe needs to be observed in any new legislation is that First Nations are entitled to take into account the knowledge of any knowledge holders in relation to their country, whether it be from their neighbours who have access to the regional forms of stories or songlines, or distant knowledge holders, or even non-First Nations people. But those decisions and the consideration of that knowledge must be by the First Nations on whose country those sites exist. The third principle is that if mining companies or developers want to challenge those decisions, then it should be done in court, because we know that the government has demonstrated that it can be overly influenced by external parties, putting it as politely as I can. Fourthly, the court should be required to consider the principles of intergenerational equity. And by this, I mean our obligations to ensure that our descendants have the benefit of the manifestations of our culture. And the court should also be required to consider the extent to which the sites of the relevant First Nation have already been impacted. So in some places, there has been such a gross level of impact that every site holds immense importance. And as I say, this should all be in standalone legislation. So I think what I might do is leave it at that point and respond to any questions that any people might have. Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks, Tony. Just on that point, we do have the Q&A that's open. So please, if you have any questions, I know it's not perfect, but given that we can't meet face to face and have a proper conversation, please put your any questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end of our session. So thanks, Tony. There's the call for standalone heritage protection continues. Must be it's been decades really that has been sought. A lot of
Heidi, I was working in the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in 1996 when we were having this discussion about standalone legislation. So,
Yep. Yeah, considering it was a recommendation of the Keane report in 1981 for a Heritage Commission, and it's precisely these failings on the part of government to respond adequately that finds where we find ourselves in situations of also failing federal laws, as we've heard from Nadia and Dolly in relation to the Gomeroi grinding groups. So one of the points Tony made is that Tony, you posed a question: who has the power? And certainly the federal minister, in response to Dolly's legal action, made a decision about who has the power and who has the greater interests. We'll hear from Tim now, because I think a lot of Tim's research really highlights that the power with the mining lobby, and certainly with the coal mining, is also a very flawed economic model. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you. And I promise not to do death by PowerPoint too badly. I've got 6 slides I will share with you. But first, I'd like to acknowledge it's my privilege to be here today with such an esteemed panel. So my thanks to Heidi, to Dolly, to Nadia and Tony. I really appreciate being able to speak today alongside you. And I'd also like to I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So, hopefully you'll be able to see a couple of slides if they come through, Heidi.
Yep, all there, we can see that. Thank you.
Great. So I think a key phrase that Nadia mentioned is perceived benefit. And we talk about the cultural heritage losses versus the perceived benefit, the cost benefit, if you like, or the economic benefit. And I would really question the perceived benefits. I think they are put forward by the proponent, and they have the absolute luxury under the legislation to overstate the benefits and understate the costs. And that's just on an economic basis before they just totally ignore the heritage, the water and other aspects like pollution and carbon. But maybe I'll just talk about, well, firstly, a quick overview on why I emphasize the point about perceived benefits. I think the whole world is changing dramatically as we speak in the energy space. And so a lot of those benefits have actually been misguided and are just plainly wrong, in my view. They're superseded by technology. The second thing I'll address is the justification that is used for coal. And thirdly, what are the alternatives? But I promise only 6 slides. So the first one, and it's a slide I use in every presentation for any audience, and I've been using it now for 8 years since I started at IEFA, a public interest think tank, and that is that the energy markets are going through a fundamental change. It's technology driven, it's unstoppable, and it's beautiful to watch as a finance person because it is just happening faster than anyone thought possible. The deflationary benefits, not only ignoring the climate change benefits, the environmental benefits, but the economic benefits, the deflationary benefits of dramatically lower costs, just make this a race that is inevitably going to be won. Now, obviously, there's a huge amount of damage with every bit of delay. There's plenty of environmental damage. But from a technology perspective, I mean, every day I read about new advances and new breakthroughs globally. And I mean, here's a chart just showing how the costs of solar have come down dramatically. And I was listening to Dr. Martin Green, who's one of the fathers of the solar industry globally. He's the head of technology development at the University of New South Wales, and he was speaking last week, and he talked about accelerating deflation in the solar sector. So it's not maturing, it's accelerating, and I couldn't agree more with him. And battery storage and green hydrogen is just accelerating that process. And I mean, one example, we saw a tender in Portugal in August, and it came in, it was a record low solar tender for a 700 megawatts. So it was $1 billion investment, and the price was $13 a megawatt hour. So it was the world record low for solar right in the middle of the pandemic. But you've got to compare these prices on a like-for-like basis. Every country's got its own energy system, its own cost structures, its own subsidies. So the number I look at is the 24% year-on-year decline. So literally just in the last year, solar in Portugal's got 24% cheaper than it was 1 year ago. And I see that same trend repeated everywhere around the world. So that's the positive news. I mean, we're probably not going to win in time, but we are going to win this, this energy war. Now, again, I put this up a little bit for theatrics, but one of my strongest allies in my statement about the magnitude of deflation is Gita Madani. Anyone who knows me in Australia knows I've been campaigning against Gita Madani for 8 years and working with the W&J people and in full admiration of the great work that they're doing there. But Gita Madani has really done a mea culpa at the start of this year. And this is an op-ed that he actually wrote at the start of, in May 2020. And he said, and it's pretty categoric, solar costs have dropped 99% in the last 4 decades, and they will drop another 99% in the next 4 decades. Now, just pause for a minute. Gita Madani is the single biggest private investor in coal trading, coal importation, coal mining, and coal power plants in India, the 3rd largest country in the world. And he's saying that renewables will inevitably win this war. And he says fossil fuels will only be playing a balancing role in the near term. Now, that's his own words. It's available on LinkedIn. And to me, it's pretty convincing. Now, also, he has, in the last 3 years, become the biggest investor in renewables in India. And in fact, he's made more money out of renewables than he's lost in coal this decade. He's made $14 billion in renewables in literally 4 years. So he's totally convinced. Obviously, for anyone who doesn't know me, he's also the proponent behind the Galilee coal mine at Carmichael. And another point is that the markets for coal are in absolute structural decline, but they're in a cyclical decline, and the pandemic is the third factor in there. So I would argue there are three factors at play. Structural, that's the technology innovation that they cannot win. Cyclical, and COVID on top of that, because the COVID pandemic globally has destroyed a huge amount of energy demand. Like in India, energy demand's down 15% this year versus last year. Now, it was meant to grow by 6% every year. And so that's a 21% swing versus what was expected only 6 months ago. And that's a huge impact, but to me the bigger impact is the structural decline. But irrespective, you can't actually break it out too categorically which of the three factors most at play. But what you can see is that with this chart, the coal price is at a multi-decade low. And I'll come back to that point, but that means almost every coal mine in Australia, in Indonesia and globally is actually losing money in the seaborne thermal coal market. So with every tonne of coal they mine and sell, they lose money. That's a pretty bad business model, which comes back to Nadia's point. The perceived cost benefit is pretty ordinary when you actually are losing money. So there's not even a profit to be had. Another point is that, and I'm very optimistic and probably more bullish today than I've ever been about the magnitude and speed of this transformation, because the global financial markets are moving rapidly. And so what they're doing, and you can argue they're dressing it up in environmental greenwash, they're doing the right thing because the alternative is they lose more money. And so banks will always do the right thing if it involves protecting their capital and maximising their profit or minimising their losses. So the banks are actually announcing a record rate of coal exit policies. So they're formally banning, divesting or restricting the supply of finance to coal mining and to coal-fired power plants. And probably the pivotal point globally was the announcement by BlackRock in 2020 January. The CEO of the biggest financial institution in the world put out an op-ed to every CEO in the world, and the title of the op-ed was, "This is a fundamental reshaping of finance." So even BlackRock gets it. And since then, we've had 49 other announcements aligning themselves, starting to align with Paris. Another factor, if that's not convincing enough, another factor that's come through this year, and I've been watching this like a hawk and debating the merits of it, but I think this is almost as profound as BlackRock's announcement in terms of global implications. But we now have this massive European-American transatlantic divide where almost every oil and gas major in Europe has committed this year to 100% decarbonisation or near 100% decarbonisation or apparent decarbonisation by 2050. And I say that because it's the European majors, it's Total, it's Shell. It started with Bernard Looney, the new CEO at BP. It's Repsol of Spain, it's Eni of Italy, it's Repsol, it's Equinor of Norway. These players were committing to spending hundreds of billions of dollars on fossil fuel developments, new fossil fuel developments this decade. And instead now they're announcing pivots. So BP alone has gone from committing to spend $500 million a year on renewables at the start of this year as Bernard Looney's opening gambit in February, to now he's committing to spend $5 billion every year for a decade. That's 50 billion, that's real US dollars, 50 billion on renewable energy from a standing start. And you've got that replicated by 6 of the biggest energy fossil fuel companies in the world. So, and another amazing change has been in last month, PetroChina in August announced that they would do the same as BP, the same as Shell, the same as Total, and commit to a near zero by 2050 target. So it's a profound change in energy markets that we're watching. And the wealth destruction of these companies, I mean, Dolly's spent the last decade or 2 decades fighting coal companies, but the financial markets are now on your side, Dolly. It's quite bizarre. I mean, this is Whitehaven's share price. Whitehaven has destroyed 83% of its shareholder wealth in just 2 years. There aren't too many CEOs who can hold their head up in public and say, yeah, oh, I destroyed 4/5 of every dollar you entrusted with me. I've destroyed it. And and I'm keeping on destroying it with every day that goes by. And I'll finish with the slides. The last one, I mean, Dolly, you mentioned Pilbara and the fact that we've now got a government, federal government, absolutely embedded with the fossil fuel industry and wanting to do a gas-led recovery. And so I just remind them whenever I talk to them, well, you're not doing it for economically sensible reasons. This is an American chart. It's the biggest fracking company in the world. Oh, sorry, I have to correct myself. It's now bankrupt. It was the founder of fracking in America. So then anyone tells you this is about economics, the excuse that the courts hear, it's about economic cost benefit. Well, the economic cost to shareholders of the biggest fracking company in the world going from $38 billion market cap to zero this year, and our government wants to do a gas-fired recovery, they're obviously ignoring finance, they're ignoring the climate, they're ignoring the cultural aspects, and they're totally out of touch, in my view, with all aspects of this. So that I will stop sharing my screen, and maybe just I'll just very quickly touch on the second and third bits. The justification for coal, why more coal or why continue with fossil fuels? Unfortunately, Australia it's the resources curse. Tony used the phrase, it's colonialism at its worst. I totally agree with you. And the combination of those, Australia exported $120 billion of fossil fuels last year. Unfortunately, because we exported $120 billion of fossil fuels, we are a global laggard in the energy transformation. We're the #1 exporter of LNG, #1 exporter of coking coal, #2 exporter of thermal coal. The incumbent industry has politically captured our politicians, particularly at the federal level, but also here in New South Wales, so that they just ignore the problem. They deny the climate science, they ignore the problem, they claim there's no certainty. Everything I've just presented, no, they just say, oh no, but there's two sides to every story. And I talked to the biggest developer and miner of coal in Asia, and he told me, oh, the coal mining industry is alive and kicking. It'll be fine for the next 20 years in Asia. That was how he started his discussion with me yesterday. And I said, well, you're just going to lose your shirt. Over the next couple of years, you'll go bankrupt, denying the reality of technology change. And we didn't have a very polite conversation, but at the end of the day, he's deluded. So it's the drug pushers' argument that they generally use. If not our coal, someone else's coal. Now, it's a totally fallacious, amoral argument. It's totally wrong. It assumes every other nation's going to do as Australia does, which is ignore the science and not embrace technology change. And ultimately, maybe China as well, because remember, China, as Dolly mentioned, is the owner. The Chinese government owns China Shenhua, which owns the Watermark mine. And I watch China very, very closely. And it's interesting they have done nothing effectively in the last decade with this mine. I reckon I reckon they actually wish they never heard of China Shenhua, of Watermark, because they've done their shirt and now they question whether or not they should even proceed. And you look at what they're doing in terms of their energy strategy. They are the world's biggest investor in the technologies and industries of the future. They are the world's leading company in wind, in solar, in hydro, in grids, in batteries, in rare earths, in lithium, now in green hydrogen. So they totally understand this is a race to lead the industries of the future, and coal's the industry of the past. So it does beg the question, keep fighting, Dolly, absolutely, because every month of delay is another reason why they'll just walk away from this project at some point. I'm sure they wish they never heard of it. But final point, and I'll finish, is on what are the alternatives? And to me, the alternatives are just as exciting as watching the destruction of the fossil fuel global empire before our very eyes. And the alternatives, I mean, Australia, I spent this morning talking for hours about Australia as a superpower. And I was thinking, oh, maybe 200% renewables. Well, a very, very senior government official was talking about, well, no, why not 700%? That's what we're going for. And then we had a debate for 2 hours about how we get to 700% renewables. Now, you might have heard of that phrase, or you might have heard of Mike Cannon-Brookes, 200% renewables. I don't care whether it's 100, 200 or 700%, but it's about the level of ambition and the opportunity for Australia. And the opportunities are extreme. We are blessed as a nation with phenomenal resources. Unfortunately, we're cursed by fossil fuel resources, but we're blessed by this beautiful land, by huge amounts of wind and solar, and we could be a world green energy superpower. So you have to think about green hydrogen, green ammonia, green aluminium, green steel, about reinvigorating our entire industrial manufacturing complex, replacing our $120 billion of fossil fuels with green exports, sustainable industries, and then making sure that those industries, those new industries, actually are done sustainably and with cultural consideration. So at that point, I will stop and be happy to answer questions along with the panel.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thank you very much. Now, I just wanted to just make a couple of points about the arrangement of our panel and just what we'll do over the next couple of minutes. So one is just in terms of building the context. I really appreciate your input, Tim. One of the things we've done in this discussion today is we've talked on a number of different scales. Firstly, there is just in terms of Dolly's and with Nadia's support, this new application to the Federal Minister to protect, in the immediate concern is to protect those sites from destruction should the Shenhua, this huge watermark mine, go ahead. And it will certainly be multitudes of sites over Gomeroi country, but it also, as Nadia's explained, it's also about transforming a landscape to a mining landscape. So we heard that is an immediate concern, and we'll in a moment, I think, look towards thinking about what action can be taken to support the campaign, the legal action that Dolly has been prosecuting for many years. Secondly, we thought about how is it that you get to a position where you're desperately trying to wrangle state and Commonwealth heritage laws to eke out the most basic protection of country. That should be it should never even get to this point. And then the third is picking up from Tony and through to Tim's work, is where does Aboriginal land sit within a broader social, political and economic transformation, so that the destruction of country is not being weighed up in these kind of cost-benefit terms, but actually where Aboriginal land holdings can be part of a much more significant change in economic relations, and that includes with the farming sector as much as with mining interests as well. So I think what we might do now is shift our discussion to thinking about action, unless amongst our panelists you have any follow-up points or anything that you'd like to add. No. Okay. Well, I'm going to jump to some of the questions that have come through in our Q&A. And there's one question here, and I'll open this up to all panelists if you have any thoughts. And the question, I guess it comes to down to shareholder activism. And the question is, who are the financial investors in the Watermark mine? And might they be more sensitive to these issues after the tragic circumstances in Juunkan Gorge? Anything to add there?
Can you speak on the investors within that, Tim?
Yeah, certainly. And that is a really relevant question in that the way you phrased it, Heidi. I mean, the investors are the Chinese government. China Shenhua is a majority Chinese government-owned entity. And so it's very much about the national interests of China. And a decade ago, China was all about importing fossil fuels. Today, it's all about building industries of the future, zero emissions. So it is actually a legacy asset. It's a stranded asset. And now they really got to work out what they do with it, if anything. They probably should just walk away or make it into an agricultural area. Agricultural food investment. But the bigger issue is the change, and I think all of our speakers have talked about it, the impact of Rio Tinto's events over the last month. I mean, the intransigence and the stupidity of the management, and then finally they've actually had to have been thrown onto their own swords because of the stupidity of their actions. But I think that is a globally relevant landmark precedent, that all of a sudden environmental, social and governance issues are front and centre for every major investor in the world and for every CEO. Now, maybe I'm overstating it. I mean, the hypocrisy and self-interest of CEOs and boards is pretty legendary, but this is pretty serious when one of the biggest companies in the world has to throw their CEO onto his own sword. Now, he didn't do it voluntarily. He was thrown onto it through his own stupidity. But that's got profound global implications that they can't ignore the cultural heritage the way they have been for the last 217 years or 20 years.
Okay. Any other comments?
I just, sorry. I'll just want to touch on the fact that we're talking about an agricultural area out there that already exists on the Liverpool Plains. It's, considered one of the major food bowls in Australia. Not only that, we're looking at a proposal as far as it remaining an agricultural, cultural and renewables precinct as opposed to mining out there, which given, the fact that it's such a huge cultural significant area, and I mean, as many other places, most of Australia is as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, but it's a great teaching tool, and should remain so for us as Aboriginal people, but it's also something that could be shared with the broader Australian community as a teaching area. And, also it's an area, Australia's, got the climate that's just ideal for solar and wind, and that area out there is ideal for both of those things. So, we don't need mining when we, if we had politicians that weren't so bloody greedy and worried about their own hip pocket and thought a bit more of the country as a whole and, the preservation of Australia and Australian people rather than being the greed.
I might just add something briefly. I have no doubt that if the light was switched tomorrow to a political environment where the government had as its primary target achieving an appropriate level of emissions and a renewable-based economy, that it would happen very quickly. It's not that it can't happen, and it's not that we don't have the capacity and the technology and industry isn't already moving that way. It's simply that like King Canute, the government is trying to hold back the tide.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Global capital will back us. Australia's got all the advantages in the world, and it comes down to the point you made, Tony, about intergenerational equity. If only that was a consideration in our cost-benefit analysis, then the answer would always be obvious. And maybe, Dolly, you mentioned mining. I tend to distinguish mining versus fossil fuel mining. And at the end of the day, I don't advocate for the end of all mining. I think we've got to have cultural considerations totally weighed up in that. We've got to be very, very aware. But certainly a lot of our opponents in the government say we're anti all mining in all circumstances, where I would argue we've got to start with the most destructive mining source in Australia, and that is thermal coal open cut mining. And if you have to do it underground mining, that's a tenth, I risk saying it, I'm not an engineer, a tenth of the damage from underground mining versus open cut. Make them go underground if they have to do it. That way they don't have to destroy the landscape. It has water risks, but far less.
I agree, Tim. The problem with governments in this country is they don't give a bugger about Australian people and our culture and what that means to us when the country's destroyed. We're the ones at the end of the day that suffer all the consequences that go with that. And as Tony said earlier, it needs to be taken out of their hands and, some sort of standalone act that they don't get to say whether something's going to be destroyed or not, because they just put it in the easy basket and tick their little boxes. And, once again, we have this just destroyed culture. It's such a huge rate in this country. the mind boggles at how many Aboriginal sites that have been blown up all over this country and every minute of every day. And it just saddens me every time, you know, and our people are heartbroken all the time. And why do we have to keep on this fight? It's just endless and it's tiring and exhausting. And, you know, we lose our old people more and more each day and nothing gets resolved.
And our young people lose the ability to understand their country and their ancestors and their landscape in the way they are entitled to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just this morning there was I was just walking by the radio and heard the commentary on a concern about a development in down southern New South Wales that would affect a cricket pitch that Donald Bradman had trained on at some point in his life, and there's an enormous amount of concern for that. But we just don't seem to have the same appetite for the care and protection of Aboriginal sites. And I think that's a point that Dallas Donnelly raises here. So Dallas raises a point that and I think this is referring to the planning processes in New South Wales where the declaration of state significant projects overrides, switches off all any kind of heritage protection. So that I think one of the point that's being made there is that the kind of destruction of Aboriginal sites across the whole of New South Wales is happening on a pretty large scale. So there are several other questions here that are more specifically focused around renewables. And what I suggest is that rather than getting into a technical debate about renewables, that we hold off some of those points and run another seminar or another webinar that looks specifically at renewables on Aboriginal land. So there are some really good questions here about the grid capacity and scarcity of precious metals, but we might hold off on some of those and pick them up in another conversation. There's a question here from Leonie Seaton about the enactment of the Uluru Statement, any kind of assistance that the sort of ideas captured in the Uluru Statement, what if they were to be enacted, if the circumstances on Gomeroi country at the moment might be addressed through that. Any thoughts?
If I might briefly, if the Constitution were amended to provide for a voice to Parliament, as I understand it operating, that voice could make recommendations to the Parliament about amendment of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. It could comment on any amendments to that act that might flow from this committee, for instance. But you know, it doesn't have a right of veto, and it's not a third chamber of Parliament, so therefore it wouldn't be able to stop any legislation that it didn't agree with, or it wouldn't be able to initiate legislation. This Uluru Statement also deals with a Truth Commission and a treaty process. In my view, there would be a capacity in the Gomeroi Nation, for instance, to enter into a treaty with the state and the Commonwealth to the effect that decisions in relation to their lands and waters would only be made with their free, prior, informed consent. It seems to me that's got the most potential.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tony. Now, just as a final, I'm just looking for this question that I saw earlier. It was along the lines of, what is to be done? What is a call to action? So we might hear from you, Dolly. What sort of support would you like to see from, we've had well over 150 or so participants here. What's the sort of support that we need in order to protect Gomeroi country and, more widely, of course?
Well, look, at the moment, our application, as we've said earlier, is still with the Minister and pending approval or not. So there's not a real lot we can do right now. I mean, other than, flood her office, let her know what people, what you think. Tell her that it's you know, absolutely disgusting that they can allow the same thing to happen on Gomeroi country that has happened with the Juunkan Gorge in WA. The only other thing I can say is that if the shit hits the fan and we lose again, then there's a whole big mountain up there that I'll be sitting on top, and you can come and sit there with me.
All right. You're on.
My suggestion is to write to your local minister, a local member for Parliament, and say in very clear terms, if your party does not provide for proper and real and adequate justice, land justice, protection of sites for Aboriginal people, then I will not vote for your party, and encourage all of your friends to do that. I don't point the finger particularly at any party. I think they've all got a lot of work to do. But that's the way in which this liberal democracy works, I suppose. And we saw an example of that on a very large scale at the last federal election, where people who were incensed by the things that Tony Abbott was doing in the Parliament in the name of his role as the member for Warringah, he even though the Warringah electorate had a 75% vote in favour of the marriage equality legislation, Tony Abbott walked out of the House and refused to vote on that item. So the things that he said and did, people took the view that they weren't going to vote for him, and they voted in an independent. And the independent they voted in is Zali Steggall, and she's running on a very strong renewable energy, pro-environment platform, which is almost entirely the opposite of where Tony Abbott was. So I think that even though we are a very small number population-wise, a lot of the fundamental principles that Aboriginal communities live by, many other Australians understand and respect, and I think more people are coming to understand that by observing and respecting our principles and our way of life is something that's for the good of the country, and people are willing to support us, and if they can write to their local MP and tell them that they won't be voting for them unless they improve their game, then I think that's one thing that can be done.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tony. The thing with government at the top level is I don't think they have enough respect for Aboriginal people in this country, and you know, that shows in their dealings with us all the time. I mean, the only time they want to put us out front and show us any respect is if they've got a dignitary come in from overseas or whatever, and they want someone to come out and do a little dance, and then it's, you know, you can go back in your box now. We've shown the world that we've got, you know, we look after our First Nations people, and we have culture and, you know, respect for our people, but it only lasts long enough for them to do their little dance and their smoking ceremony, and then it's, you know, no longer on the table. It's the, you know, that minimum amount of respect at that time, and I wouldn't really call it respect. I think it's just tokenism, and then we don't want to hear about you again. There's no real respect for Aboriginal people and what this country means to us and what our connection is. You know, like, we have a connection to this land that is just undeniable, and it's so hard to convey that to other people for other people to understand. You know, it really makes me sad and brings me to tears whenever I think of the destruction and the sadness that our people all over this country have to feel. And it's not just about Gomeroi country and what's destroyed there, but it's what's destroyed all over this land every day.
I should also add, as a matter of hope, I agree with everything that you've just said, but as a matter of some hope, I know that when I was in primary school, I was told that all the Aboriginal people had been killed out, and I would go home and I'd go, well, what are we? What's happened here? And but I know that my children at school now, just into high school, are learning a level of respect for Aboriginal culture that is totally different to when I went to school, and I have some much greater hope for that generation, rather than the people who are in power now who were of my generation. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. I think the hope is with this next generation coming through and the generations after, and that's where I believe the change will be made.
Yep. Well, I think on that more optimistic note, Dolly, thank you for your decades of dedicated work to protect our country. Thank you to you, Nadia, for speaking and really adding some important clarity and explanation of where we're up to in terms of the legal case. To you, Tony, for your hard work and your commitment to our people. And thank you very much, Tim, for sharing your financial expertise. It was, you added a really important dimension, I think, to this discussion of what is also about caring for country and heritage protection and economic transformation. Thank you very much, panellists. Thank you very much for those of you who turned up. I'm sorry we're not here together in person. Hope to see you all soon. Please keep an eye out. Therese will send a follow-up email with details about the minister who you might be interested in writing to, and ongoing seminars and events that we'll be organising that are around dedicated and around the focus of Aboriginal land justice in New South Wales and broadly across the country. So thank you all very much. Thanks for your time, and hope to see you all soon.